Royal drama has erupted once again. Shocking reports reveal that Queen Camilla was allegedly caught by Princess and in a heated moment, throwing hot tea directly at young Princess Charlotte. This explosive confrontation left the entire royal family in disbelief, and what followed may have sealed Camilla's fate forever. In the sumptuous breakfast parlor at Buckingham Palace, a subdued air of freshly baked morning pastries, Earl Grey, and also something else hung like a shroud. It wasn't the sort of tension that could be eased through a chat, but a tangible strain that even the gilded chandeliers appeared to groan under, as though they were in on hidden truths. The polished mahogany table, long and gleaming like a mirror, mirrored not only the opulent silver platters and delicate china but the more arcane sotto voce dynamics among those who sat around it that fateful morning. What was planned as a regular royal breakfast would lead to an event that would rock both the monarchy and the country. The day had been like any other in the palace on the surface at least. Over that light early grey light filtered through mist and touched the palace gardens with a gentling radiance. The royal household was busy being in their merry way long before the family gathered, as staff ensured every detail, from teacup positions to napkin folds, was absolutely perfect. The vibe of perfect palace life concealed an unmentioned level of tension. Tensions among family members were palpable, waiting like a powder keg for a spark that would ignite something much more dangerous than mere conjecture. One young royal missing from the table at breakfast was Princess Beatrix, who was sitting at her grandfather's right hand, at the head of the table. She was in a neatly ironed, pale blue dress with a dicky bow in her hair. Her natural curiosity was hardly able to be reined in. From time to time she cast a look at her near aunt, Princess. In all kindness the latter gave her little comforting smiles. This presence served as a form of stability for the young girl, especially during times where the atmosphere around her seemed unsure. This had to do with Queen Camilla sitting across from Charlotte. Usually an oasis of calm in public, this morning, Camilla's face was oddly unreadable. Even those close to her understand that, despite her generally composed picture, smiling for the cameras while exchanging pleasantry with dignitaries, she had a talent of allowing herself to show moments of vulnerability behind closed doors. Somewhere in her eyes that day there was a spark that was not part of the myth-making. It may have been a product of recent public duties, a cause of vexation over something private or, just perhaps, something more simmering and deep-rooted that had long been boiling under the surface of royal protocol. Whatever it was, there were hints, drumming her spoon against the edge of the delicate china cup in an idle yet forceful manner, lingering glances towards Charlotte, and sometimes muttering quietly to herself when she thought no one was paying attention. The princess, known for her sharp observations and protective treatment of the younger royals, noted the itty-bitty hints. She was always watching out for Charlotte and her brothers, understanding only too well that life in the limelight was as cruel as it was privileged. Raised in an elitist setting, she had learned how fast kindness could be turned into a weapon or a sign of weakness. At that morning meal her mind was more alert than usual. It was perceptible that the searching glance of Camilla more than once tended in its scrutiny towards Charlotte. It was not the loving scrutiny of a step-grandmother, there was an edge to it that could not be ignored. The morning conversation was light, ranging from forthcoming charity events and the weather to a funny story shared by Prince William about a royal dog that swiped a tea sandwich. But, below the laughter, an obvious strain bubbled. When Charlotte asked about a painting on the wall of a sitting room, a portrait of a past queen, Camilla's answer was short, almost dismissive, as though the child's inquisitiveness were a nuisance. Despite the smallness of the occurrence, the lack of respect did not escape Anne. And the moment that changed everything. It only lasted a few seconds, but everyone who was there remembers it, a silver teapot steaming gently before Camilla as Charlotte, inculcated with good manners, reached for her cup to take a little sip. Her eyes following her movements and, in what might have been a faked maneuver, she jerked her cup at Charlotte. The boiling hot tea flew through the air, the drops pinging dangerously close to the tiny princess. The reaction around the table was a collective gasp. A few drops splashed onto Charlotte's clothes, but not enough to do any damage. The look of surprise on her face was clear. Her small hands froze halfway through the air, her lips parted without a sound for a short time. There was a strange hush, the hours seemed to stand still. Then, Princess Anne's voice pierced the stillness, slicing and authoritarian. It wasn't loud but sounded like that of someone who had seen something she would never be able to unsee. "What are you thinking?" she spat, her eyes not breaking contact with Camilla. All eyes were on the queen consort, who instants before, in an effort to cover her retreat, had assumed a defiant appearance, then one of simulated indifference. Camilla's answer came smartly, and as it were by premeditation. She claimed it was an accidental slip while adjusting her cup. The princess, however, who had for many years been accustomed to the crooked paths of both truth and diplomacy, was not convinced. There was something fine about the movement, the direction of the spill. It didn't seem to be an accident. The doubts in her voice echoed softly in the murmurs at her end of the table. The crew and the surrounding men leaped to help, tending to Charlotte, patting at her dress, murmuring to her. Charlotte was quite taken aback, but was able to keep her age very well. She looked up for reassurance and he put a firm hand on her shoulder. Her jaw was clenched in a manner that conveyed she was not going to let this just go without a sound. In those tense minutes, something irreversible happened. The fragile civility that had covered over the tension between Camilla and some sections of the family was ripped off to expose the open secret that had for so long been openly whispered about. Senior royals and some of her closest staff were witnesses to this unfolding drama. The implications were vast. In a household where image was paramount, such an occurrence would have consequences well beyond the breakfast room, whether accident or oversight. What makes this moment so important is not only the act but the timing. With the royal family already under the media and public microscope, tiptoeing through relationships inside the palace and out, the slightest bit of trouble could have been exaggerated and received negative attention for the monarchy. But this was some scenario that had media frenzy written all over if it got out. The thought of Queen Consort throws tea at Princess in headlines, it almost felt laughably improbable, and yet it had just happened. And as the room settled back into itself, the unasked question hung heavy in the air: what was next? Would this just become something buried under more royal public relations and mannerly statements, or would the truth be bound to come out sooner or later? There was a hint in Princess Anne's reaction that it might be the latter. She never let insult to herself pass when it concerned a child in her hands. Perhaps it can still trigger protective responses in Eva's mind. If any bird is protecting her own, it's me. Is that a threat? Now, you've been a solid friend and a support to her this whole time. My fear of Camilla is justified. Keeping it 100, you had concerns about your girl, Camilla, before all this. In that grand setting, so laced with history, the first of the chain reactions was being set off that would lead to such a momentous decision, one that would shake royal family to its core. The Grand Palace, with its splendor and history, was about to play host to the scene of an intensely dramatic showdown in more recent royal history. It wasn't just an etiquette violation, it was personal. It was intentional. And as we will see with further chapters, this was the beginning of the end for Camilla behind palace walls. The morning before the storm was deceitfully calm. Outside London and its streets rumbled with their morning bustle as delivery trucks shed pallets of wares, black cabs chugged and hissed over damp cobblestones, and office workers tugged coats against the chill. Inside London, and life moved to a regimen girded by centuries-old ritual. The day started with the blood pounding of servants up marble corridors. The tasks were carried out with perfect organization, but behind the facade of calmness there was an unmistakable undercurrent of nerves. Princess Charlotte sat up in bed in her chamber, and this time the golden light did not go away. Blessed with an instinct for picking up atmosphere, she felt the tension among them without even having breakfast. The resource signs of disgust were everywhere, in the curt house of your lords and ladies to the way her nanny failed ran age to that certain staff. Charlotte had been born and raised in a society that placed an emphasis on manners before morals, and her insight into such matters seemed well beyond her years. She heard the undertone of unease in voices that morning, the subtext of private conversations. At the same time, in her private quarters at the palace, Camilla was tended to by her personal dresser. Being the Queen's lady-in-waiting, a responsibility associated with having to share breakfast with the senior royals in spite of her reluctance, those close to the Queen consorts already knew Queen Elizabeth II was never keen with these family breakfasts, meals that were more than just about food. It was politicized ecosystem at the very least. A recent argument about a royal engagement had left Camilla dejected, her thoughts dismissed in favor of those of Princess Anne. Those would be small matters in the eyes of outsiders, but in the complex royal hierarchy, they all added up. Princess Anne, who was already waiting in the breakfast room, showed her characteristic punctuality, a charm she had cultivated not just for the sake of good manners, but as a means of establishing authority. All morning long she watched in silence, eyeing the table settings, surveying the staff's execution and surveying the seating arrangements. Against Camilla sat Charlotte's place card, and she felt a little pang of unease. Choi kept a cool exterior, but inwardly she vowed to keep a close eye on things. Camilla's train of sly and biting wit and jest had not escaped her on their few former acquaintances, and wary as she was for her youngest brother, she could not risk his being chilled and discouraged by such thinly veiled sarcasms as disgusted herself. It wasn't long before tension simmered when Prince William walked in with Charlotte. There was even a hint of friction behind his courteous but somewhat aloof smile in the direction of his stepmother. The few polite words suddenly seemed too easy, too practiced. Camilla's replies were equally scripted, as if she were reading from some teleprompter. A close observer, who was skilled at reading faces, detected a slight sneer on the lips of Camilla. Royal tradition reverberated around the table as Charlotte spoke. The white linen and shiny silver cutlery, as well as china cups from the palace collection, stood in stark relief against the soft light. But not even such a beautiful setting could hide the tension that was building among certain family members. While the footman poured the first round of tea, he saw her grip her cup a little too tightly, as if pointedly not looking at Charlotte's modest little hands on her cup, stirred round in circles. It was not only the seating coordination or the polite pleasantries that signaled a turn that morning. There had been whispers in the days preceding breakfast, tittle-tattle about arguments over house rules and Camilla's exasperation at being treated in private by certain family members. These whispers didn't first circulate in the press, but swept quickly around the walls of the palace. Staff were trained to keep all of their facial expressions neutral when communicating the messages of certain officials to each other, to avoid the withering, passive-aggressive glances. All this lurked behind the scenes from Charlotte, who strove to concentrate on her toast and the slender pot of marmalade before her. She watched her niece closely whilst talking in a light and assuring tone. Every time Camilla might be about a bit snappy, I always had that sense of that readiness to step in if necessary, as an undertone of conversation. Camilla seemed to be thinking about something also. She was not given to frequent outbreaks, but managed to make her feelings known by word and act, and we never were the bosom friends rubbing against each other with unity of feeling. Charlotte's natural and instant appeal, both to her family and the public, was aligned with an ease and charm of character with which Camilla may have felt a vague threat to her own status. So whether it was as if she consciously felt it, or were unconsciously grieved by it, it brooded on her, like a shadow. The morning's dramatic moment came not with loud voices but with silence thick with tension. The kind of silence that follows a gloriously stinging remark. The way she brought up Charlotte's interest in the art at the palace, while innocent in and of itself, they had an unpleasant undertone that caused something to be set loose inside of Charlotte, something that caused her to furrow her brow. Taken aback, Charlotte looked down at her plate, not knowing what to say. She swore she wouldn't allow that day to pass without being more alert. After that the breakfast was always a little dull. Conversations became disjointed. I was glancing nervously all too often to the other side of the table, disturbing the harmony of the regular meal. As the footmen served the guests, they exchanged knowing glances, aware that they were serving up much more than tea and toast. They were playing to a room full of people hiding their emotions. What the palace outsiders didn't know, however, was that this bit in the build-up to the incident was just as important as the incident itself. The tension was building up. Each look, quick reply, lulling conversation contributed to an atmosphere of awkward tension. The tea was poured again, and already there was a sense that the room was a room prone to eruption, a burst that would take the day's events and the mechanics of the palace at an unexpected angle. It happened so quickly, no one could realize what was really going on until it was over. As the second round of tea was served, the hum of voices was broken by the dulce clink of silver against china. It was a time that would have been completely routine, a matter of every day, and an act of tradition. But something in the atmosphere had changed, and it's caused the low hum of courtesy beneath the gathering to break, now replaced by an undercurrent of tension. "Aunt," said Princess Charlotte, "I am going to fey a book to you." Her eyes glittered and her hands gestured expressively while she was talking and leaning in, listening close to the young girl who was sitting across from her. Camilla had the teacup in her two hands, and was looking not at her own interlocutor, but at Charlotte. It was the kind of gaze that could evoke any number of responses depending upon the observer. It was absent-minded perhaps, some thought it was scrutinizing, and thought it calculating. As the footman came up with the silver teapot, and the light of the chandelier on its shining surface, Camilla quietly made him wait, instead of filling the cups. She went to lift the pot. It wasn't unusual for her to pour for herself, but the way she grasped the pot that morning was different somehow, careful yet concentrated, as though she concentrated at every motion occurring. Tipping the kettle over her mug, she poured the dark liquid in one slow, even trickle until it was almost full. Keeping eye contact with Charlotte, she set the pot down and lifted her spoon to begin stirring. Just at that moment, Charlotte reached for her cup to sip. What followed occurred in under 2 seconds, but none who were in the room that night would ever forget it. Camilla's hand shifted, not an awkward, accidental movement but a sudden, deliberate course. The teacup in her hand tipped over, pouring a scalding finger of liquid from which splashed out in a thin narrow streak to the table, barely under the edge of Charlotte's gown. Charlotte gasped out her shock, her slender body drawing back in horror with wide eyes. It was a sound that came afterwards, following the odd clatter and clank of the sound that her breath had produced, sprayed out with a blast of a sudden warmth and surprise. Porcelain striking the table was to be accompanied by a hefty gasp from one of the staff, and the jarring scrape of a chair as Charlotte had stood. It was her voice, cutting through the room like a hot knife. Though she didn't raise her voice, the emphasis in her tone was unmistakable. "Camilla," there was warning and reproach in the name. "What are you doing?" It was not a question, but an indictment wrapped in the trappings of formality. Every eye in the room was on the Queen. There were wide-pewed eyes of incredulity and narrowed eyes of suspicion. Camilla, however, remained unfazed. She let the cup down with exaggerated attention to pursue her lips around a mislaid half-smile in the tension. "It was an accident," she said, quietly. Her tone did not waver, almost bored. The cup had been too hot. "I lost hold," she repeated, her unblinking eyes steady. "It was an accident," she repeated, although there was a doubting tone. The room was dead quiet except for the low ticking of the clock on the far wall. Charlotte watched the women, inching toward them for safety. The servants came quickly to the aid of the child princess, one on her knees sponging the tea from the delicate gown, and another replacing her cup with a fresh one. The professionalism was immaculate, but it couldn't hide an air of disquiet. The peaceful image of breakfast in the morning had been replaced by a world where royal composure was a sword-thin line. What most struck witnesses was the lack of an apology. Camilla was calm and didn't help them or say something soothing, what would have been expected in such a case. Her justification hung in the air, without a hint of sincere regret. In a world of appearances and perceptions, his absence was as accusatory as a positive avowal, as his eyes went to the empty chair of King Charles. He was behind that morning and they hadn't even joined him in their room yet. She had a momentary feeling that his absence had left the moment unmediated. Perhaps it was just as well. No buffer meant no need for her to contain her initial reaction. With a tender hand to Charlotte's shoulder, she began to speak softly. There was no longer the glance of affection when she once more cast her eyes on Camilla. The air grew stiff instead of soft. Dialogue did not recommence. Nobody really picked up their earlier conversations. Charlotte's soiled linens were the only things the staff replaced quietly. They continued to have composed expressions, but their eyes were saying a whole lot. "It's okay, dear," but the soft sentiment had gone from her eyes when they again made contact with Camilla's. The climate didn't cool down, it stayed in place. The conversation did not pick back up, no one resumed exactly where they had left off. The staff were the only ones moving around as they quietly took away the soiled linens from Charlotte's place setting and replaced them with clean ones. Their faces were as collected, but there was no mistaking their eyes. Nobody answered, in the quiet of the room. The morning reached its final conclusion, its point of no return. Princess Anne's response to the event was prompt, but controlled. Those who knew her understand that she did not let feelings inform her public behavior, but that doesn't mean she was indifferent. Rather, she had chosen to remain composed. Conscious of her position, and the ever-watchful glances of the public eye, she had concealed a burning spite under a decorum to which there was never a loophole. And as the breakfast room fell silent and the staff hurried efficiently about, the princess sat upright, nodding and smiling reassuring smiles to Charlotte. But her expression toward Camilla was steely, and it was honed over decades of royal life. There had been dozens of times when her mind had argued one thing and she'd acted on another, but a single rule had governed her behavior. It was also important that children be protected from any conflicts among adults and that family squabbles should not be overheard by the children. After her place setting was put back and her dress mostly dried, "Do eat your toast if you want to, dearest," she said softly but firmly. It wasn't just a request, it was a stealth order to act nonchalant, to undermine Camilla and her games ahead with her too. Charlotte's dainty fingers poised as she gripped her fork once more, no sign she was about to let this one slide without some fireworks. Charlotte laid her napkin finally folded across the table, and rose again. Every eye followed her, as she passed round the table on her way to the door, not intimating for Camilla to attend her, but taking it for granted she would obey. There was a moment of hesitation before Camilla sighed and relented. The door thudded shut behind them more vociferously than they would have wished. The hallway behind it extended, lined with portraits of ancestors and kings. And their painted eyes had the same whiplash force that they did now. Charlotte made a whole pass before stopping herself sharply. And Camilla following her, half angry, half caution for a moment. They rose softly and stood listening to the sound of muffled voices coming from the breakfast room, a far-off buzz. "Don't bother trying to make that out to be an accident," she said, tone level but a little flinty. "I've been around long enough to know when a calculated play is made." Her voice wasn't raised but it reverberated down the corridor. Camilla pursed her lips, raising her chin in defiance. "You're making a stink over nothing," Camilla replied calmly, as if she were the sane one. "It was nothing but a tea over." "She's fine," she said stoically, her eyes narrowing. "A spill does not result in burns, and your aim was too accurate for it to be the result of simple clumsiness, even if it never touched her skin. Don't think I don't see through the likes of you by now, Camilla," she went on glaring through the politeness. Camilla bristled but bit her tongue. Knowing that any word could be used against her, she drew closer, speaking more quietly. "Your title does not give you the right to treat her or any other teacher or any other children as pawns. I won't stand for it. Do you comprehend?" Her sassy words just hung there in the air like a challenge. Camilla did not speak, only nodded shut before moving backwards. All of this had transpired in less than 2 minutes, but its ramifications would last long after she turned on her heel and headed back toward the breakfast room. Her expression smoothed back to its usual royal mask, and Camilla followed a few paces behind, a slight flush dusting her cheeks telling of her true feelings upon her return to the room. The silence hung, the air suddenly cooler and crisper. Not only could the bystanders see something had changed, something notable had happened. Charlotte gave a little tiny nod, but the message was clear, causing the atmosphere to become very strained as the remaining adults made small chat among themselves sporadically. Camilla looked down at her plate, refusing to look at Charlotte, or anyone else, for that matter, but carefully observing the furtive glances given her by the staff. There would be gossip, of course they always did as palace staff, but she would be the one to shape the story before it got outside the walls. After the sometimes hectic meal, Charlotte excused herself from her morning engagements, now her one priority to talk to King Charles himself before Camilla had time to spin the story for her. Knowing her brother as she did, she realized what he thought of confrontation in general and toward personal relationships in particular. This time, she was adamant that the diplomatic process should not dominate the safety and dignity of her granddaughter. She sensed the morning's events were already having a ripple effect: the whispers in the corridors, the knowing looks and small changes in staff reactions as she made her way through the palace en route to Charles's private study. She could unleash a storm of squalls behind shut doors, and did not mean to let it go by default. King Charles's personal study was a refuge from the palace, and he took care to make it feel more like a place of work than a royal chamber. Shelved with leather-bound books and family photographs, hung with grave curtains to moderate the light flooding through the long windows and filled with the scent of wood polish and fresh coffee, it was a refuge where Charles could meditate on correspondence, confer with advisors and lose himself in the contemplation of art and architecture. The ring princess came to the door with a certain air, though punctuated by a degree of deliberateness. A moment's introduction by the chamberlain and she stepped into the study. From his desk, Charles, who seemed preoccupied with whatever was trying his patience at the moment, glanced up with a little crease between his eyes. He meets her with sincere affection, with just a hint of curiosity. Nothing out of the ordinary, really. She hadn't come at an odd hour, but after breakfast like that was rather upfront, and absent pleasantries suggested urgency. The door shut behind with a gentle click and the mood changed. "We have to talk," she said, in a calm but steel-tinged voice. Charles indicated a large armchair next to the fire, but she continued standing. She stood firm, and looked at him with the intensity that made it clear it was no small thing. Laying his pen down, he saw her favorite stance, remotely at attention, arms hanging straight at her side, shoulders squared, which meant she was not there to advise. She had come to deliver facts, and not always easily digestible ones. "It is Charlotte, of course," she began, summarizing the breakfast with exactness. Her words were plain, but pregnant with thought. She described how the tea came to fly, the look in Camilla's eyes, the fact that he hadn't apologized, and how premeditated it had seemed. Charles's face went from polite surprise to incredulity as she talked. Reclining in the chair, one hand idly resting under his chin as if to keep his thoughts from stumbling, he began, "You're sure it wasn't," but he was cut off by her before he could finish the word accident. "I am sure," she declared. "I have seen much that was clumsy enough, but that was no malice." She very much intentionally tipped that cup and then just sat there with no sorry at all. Charles's gaze rolled over to a picture of Charlotte on his desk, a family photo they'd taken the year before at that get-together. As he looked at the candid image, his stern look softened for a moment under the twin burdens of royal responsibilities and grandfather. He said, "You know as well as I do that if it were another member of the family, well, then slap on the wrist and away you go. Charge that she, the queen consorts, have been wittingly or otherwise instrumental in harming my granddaughter, and you will sound the sort of scandal that will reshape everything," Charles went on, his voice quiet but steady. "This needs to be dealt with, and dealt with seriously, otherwise every family will know that they can get away with stuff," they wrote to staff. Charles, I won't stand for it, and neither should you. With a deep breath full of a mix of resignation and frustration, he concluded, I need to confront her, pausing to think the idea over before continuing, but not until you have taken a stand. To do so will be to play into her hands. She is skilled at that. And so you have to decide whether you are protecting her or protecting Charlotte. The silence which ensued was oppressive, save for the subdued ticking of the mantel clock. Charles got up and walked over to the window, looking over the gardens as though the sight of the naked winter branches could bring him a clearer understanding. She looked at him, knowing full well this was about more than just one incident, that it had to do with palace power playing and the impression his behavior would send to the public and, actually, his own family. You have never been one to mince words, Charles finally spoke, still refusing to look at her. Thanks, Captain. I know, but you also know that if you schedule her to leave the palace, even temporarily, the populace will explode. He hesitated and then said, without a second thought, let the storm blow in. That is better than a slow slide into disrespect for this institution. If she stays after this, it's going to be very hard not to say something. The children are going to see it, the staff is going to see it, and in the end, so will the public, Charles said, looking at her. There was a trace of struggle in his eyes, but also a glimmer of conviction. He sat down at his table, and he pulled out his pen, and without mentioning what he was doing, he started writing. She knew that the jottings were so much waiting material for his coming devastation with Camilla, or orders to his private secretary to draw out a plan of campaign. Anyway, she had made her position known. You give me no choice, she declared as Charles put down the pen and said, I'll see to it, nodding once. That's all I ask. She left the study without a word, her footfalls echoing in the long hallway. Charles was sitting as still as a statue, staring into the paper before him, knowing well what he was about to do. It was no mere matter of more formal or better etiquette, it was a line in the sand where no line had seemed drawn, where boundary jumping had seldom proven in and of itself of immediate consequence. But this time was different. The public disclosure of the episode was not something that had been carefully planned by the palace. Within the well-managed realm of royal image governance, scandals would usually be contained, diluted and, if possible, purged before they reached the outside world. But the incidents that morning in the palace were of such intensity that it was impossible to conceal them. When they came to clear away the breakfast remnants, voices were already grumbling through the Modoike staff. Within an industry in which any turn of phrase might seep down to infomediaries, it was only a matter of time before the story emerged into broader public view. Initially, the revelations came to light in whispers, with a well-connected royal correspondent handed a mysterious tip, a confrontation over a private family breakfast between senior members of the royal household and a younger member of the royal family. Aware of the sensitivity of such matters, the reporters started whispering to trusted insiders of the palace's underbelly, drivers, kitchen staff, and aides, all who happened to be in the loop on occurred next. The responses were tentative at first, but the words kept surfacing in Camilla, Charlotte and Princess Anne's whispers as they replied. It didn't require much gumshoeing for the journalist to discern the fundamentals of the situation. Within hours, in a private group chat among senior royal journalists, questions were flying, cautiously, very cautiously, about what it would mean to be putting out unverified information. But as they traded notes, they became more clear on the situation. There was one, if minor, physical altercation involving the daughter of the future king. Just that would have warranted a headline move. It was a leak that came out on social media before it reached the newspapers. An anonymous account that appeared to have inside knowledge of royal matters issued a puzzling message: when you push negative onto a negative, it makes a positive. Ask Charlotte. The enigmatic post sent the royal gossip-following public into speculation overdrive, inspiring a spate of theories in comment sections, from the wildly implausible to uncomfortably near the mark. By late afternoon, one of the tabloids had splashed across its front page a headline artfully concocted to suggest there was tension at palace breakfast between senior royals. The article did not name Charlotte directly, but it was about a younger royal family member, and referred to Camilla's role in a rare falling out that shocked others at the table. Readers hardly needed an imagination to fill in the blanks. The reaction was immediate as internet forums dissected the language in the article, with some supporting Camilla and others tearing into her. The hashtag #ProtectCharlotte began trending within hours, shared by people who believed the incident to have been more sinister than the media had let on. Royal fans noted that on Wednesday, Princess kept busy with a charity event and appeared calm and determined, whereas Camilla was missing from her scheduled public appearance at the palace. The communications team was in a panic, staring at two choices: to flatly deny the story, risking even more speculation, or to say something nebulous so as to deflate it without appearing guilty. It was the expected diplomatic draft that they chose, acknowledging only that Her Majesty, the Queen Consort, and members of the royal family had a private breakfast that morning. The statement had aspired to sound definitive while actually saying very little. It asserted that reports of discord had been exaggerated and unhelpful. But the message did not get through. The palace's mansplaining, mischievously downplaying the issue, confirmed for many in the public's mind that there was a deeper story at play. Television and radio commentators started debating its underlying implications. If things really were reaching breaking point behind the scenes, what did that say about the cohesion of the royal household? And why had Princess, who was famously loyal to the institution, appeared to give her imprimatur to whatever line William and Kate were pushing by unexpectedly joining Charlotte for a walkabout later that day? Even overseas media picked up on the story, with European and U.S. headlines including the cautious royal family faces rumored rift to the sensational Camilla in hot water over breakfast incident with Princess Charlotte. The privacy-focused variety of that coverage was particularly dangerous, suggesting purposeful wrongs no palace release could hope to fix. For insiders, the most damning details weren't in the media, but the palace itself. Pubdate: over the ensuing days she felt increasingly hemmed in. In the wake of the incident, she was not present at some family gatherings, and when she did appear in public, she was flanked by senior aides who seemed unusually watchful. In the meantime, Charlotte and Princess were often together, the latter assuming a self-constituted protectorship without disguise. The public reaction at the start led to what would happen next. Although the palace issued a series of statements, the combination of leaked details, the public disobedience and public sympathy for a child had already turned it into something other than a private affair. It was becoming a public reckoning. Behind palace doors, the palace was in crisis management mode. And although the public may have seen a calm exterior, carefully posed photos from royal engagements and carefully worded statements, within palace walls, the atmosphere was frosty. The communications office, senior advisors, and a number of key members of the royal household had convened in a secure, private meeting room, and done so in a hurry. This was a space of unofficial planning during politically sensitive periods, prized for its soundproofing and separation from public areas of the palace. A senior, well-practiced palace communications chief presided over the gathering. He began to poke the fire with quick, serious gestures. "We're on the brink of a pivotal moment," he said. "Public opinion is changing, with each minute that goes by without a plan. What is at stake is the narrative defining itself," she said. Around the table, the lineup of press officers, legal advisors, and senior courtiers nodded gravely. The main concern was to assess the quantum of damage. Early reports indicated that social media conversations related to the incident were exponentially higher than engagement in other royal news. Mention of the hashtag #ProtectCharlotte had appeared hundreds of thousands of times along photos of the young princess at earlier public engagements. There was clearly too much public emotion for the story to die down quietly. Also, the story now was being influenced by the public beyond the influence of the palace. That includes unconfirmed details from sources who cannot be named telling Pecker that they were privy to inside information, with fears of potential defamation suits reigning supreme. Whilst none of those sources with any credibility had specifically blamed Camilla with malice, the innuendo was enough to generate concern. One legal advisor said there was danger of defamation suits because of the tone of the narrative. However, a top advisor warned against the use of legal threats to squash rumors, with one warning that it could backfire and appear as defensive, which could suggest culpability. A new reality had to be fabricated, accessible enough not to refute the old reality, but different enough to distract from it. One suggestion was to repackage it as a misunderstanding at a light-hearted breakfast. The communications team put forward the idea of releasing images of previous family meals showing Camilla and Charlotte in tender moments. But the problem was, there was very little recent imagery of real warmth between the two of them, rather than mere politesse. Faking warmth in images could look paper-thin to the public. A more strategic suggestion was to tactfully remind people Camilla led a busy public life amidst her royal duties, depicting Cam in a light of loyalty to England and a symbol of solidarity. Although it was a move that could not erase the incident, only a vulnerable human being can do that, it could be a way to change the conversation from the family's failures to its fortitude. Yet even this tactic came with its complications, as too much of a fuss being made of public engagements risked inadvertently drawing attention to the counterpoint that is Camilla and, possibly, exasperate existing criticisms. Meanwhile, staff at Camilla's household also held separate meetings to discuss damage limitation and advise on how to protect her from harm's way of bad publicity. There had been talk of scaling back her public appearances in the immediate future, allowing the story to cool somewhat, before a soft re-entry focused on her charity work. An idea was brought up to possibly visit a children's hospital or literacy initiative, to steer public perception of her into a more caring, accessible light. Anything that was consciously done about that needed to come at the right time so that it didn't look like repairing the damage, but a demonstration of goodwill. These strategic conversations were happening behind the scenes while King Charles was meeting privately with his confidants and considering not only the public truth, but the private truth. His sister's account of the rape was candid and he trusted her discretion. But the political sensibility came from Camilla's future post as queen consort. Even removing her from the palace in the short term would be an extraordinary, modern-day departure that could affect the public standing of the monarchy. However, doing nothing may undermine our confidence in the institution's moral authority. Instead, the communications team went with a varied approach. At first, they hoped to release a brief statement stressing family unity, minimizing the episode, but not quite denying it. They also planned to photograph Charlotte looking happy and unfazed in public with both parents in the coming week. The visual was an effort to put the public at ease about Charlotte's condition, without drawing her further into the controversy. They also suggested a low profile for Camilla over a number of weeks and a planned protocol of her appointments, done privately, to try to ensure she was not to be placed in any position of public controversy. Still, the story had clearly spun out of control despite the palace's efforts to rein it in. The country's media had begun to run editorials questioning harmoniousness in the royal household and comparing the dispute unfavorably to previous royal conflicts that had shaken public confidence. The palace's internal tracking reports actually showed a significant downward trend in positive feelings about Camilla, something that might take months or even years to reverse. Towards the end of the meeting, the head of communications issued one final order: we have to prepare for escalation. And if more information comes out, as looks likely, the situation will become ever more difficult to handle. Everyone in this joint needs a cheeky reminder about what confidential means. Staff were reminded again of the consequences for sharing information with the media, and internal communications security protocols were strengthened. The senior team knew without anyone saying a word that the incident could not be undone but could be managed, reformed, and mitigated. The image of a young princess having thrown hot tea, her aunt coming to her defense, hung in the public's memory, casting a shadow over every heart-opening move the palace would make in the future. Camilla's leaving of the palace was a carefully staged episode which was mercifully devoid of fireworks. Those in attendance understood the swift move, rare for internecine disputes, as a message being sent. This was no less than a public declaration smuggled in a personal decision. The unambiguous decision, which King Charles had taken after great deliberation with the princess, his senior advisers, and trusted courtiers. Camilla would move from Buckingham Palace to her home in Wiltshire indefinitely. Portrayed as a step toward domestic tranquility, the truth was more dire. It was a rare occurrence in recent history to see a queen consort leave the main royal residence while the monarch stayed. It started early in the morning and before most of the domestics had settled to their work. Only a tight, effective unit became responsible for managing that transition. These were not new assistants, they were experienced members of the royal household who fully understood the meaning of their role. They moved briskly along the private corridors with quiet purpose, following strict instructions to pack their personal items, cause minimum disruption, and get done before the palace's formal schedule kicked in. After breakfast, Camilla was told, not by Charles, but by his private secretary, "You will be delighted to hear this." The note was a cautious one, but the intent was clear. Camilla's answer was first shocked silence, then a cool, almost merciless tone. It wasn't characteristic of her to do so, and it was at times like this that she wanted most to keep her emotions locked away, yet the expression of tension on her face and the trembling in her hand said as much as any words could do. Woman to woman she asked to see Charles, but was immediately refused. He was in meetings and could not spare time until that afternoon, a careful device on the part of Charles to prevent a public confrontation in the presence of staffs within the next hour. The inconspicuous trunks and cases were quietly brought to her stateroom. Her personal staff had methodically listed every little thing, from clothing and jewelry to personal letters. The team of removal worked with respect to her privacy and swiftly, so it hadn't any time to loiter in the palace. Every time he packed up, it felt symbolic. It hadn't just been the moving of things, it had meant a loss of status. As packing proceeded, the rumors flowed through the house as if in a gossip cauldron. Whispers circulated swiftly. Attendants passed glances around in the corridors, glancing toward the queen consort wing as if expecting her to materialize at any moment. High-ranking staff made it abundantly clear, no talks with the press or as much as the hint of an indirect reference outside the palace. But secrecy was getting harder. Too many witnesses had seen too much. The real departure was hushed and for good. 2 black Range Rovers pulled up to a quiet side entrance, reserved mostly for private arrivals and departures, shortly before noon. This entrance wasn't the frenzied forecourt filled with the media. It was not an exultant departure, therefore, but a discreet one, not an escape from the building, but into a secure courtyard. Out came Camilla flanked by 2 officials, wearing a well-cut coat and carrying a little handbag. She wasn't even trying to conceal her identity, she hadn't put on sunglasses or a scarf or anything. Her chin lifted in defiance, her face a blank mask that read dignity or disdain, depending on who was reading. Her security details were close behind, and efficiently packed the suitcases into 2 cars. They exchanged few words between them, only brief information was exchanged relating to the tactical details of departure. She then just got into the back of the first car, the door closed quietly, and off the motorcade drove, with not a fuss to be made. From the outside, an Illy may have appeared as just another trip through a palace passageway. Even if it was dressed up as a temporary exile for public consumption, the writing was on the wall. The reaction was mixed amongst the staff, and as Camilla was absent, some of the tensions formed after the breakfast incident on Friday were starting to dissipate. But for others, the abruptness of her exit was a clear statement, even people at the highest levels were vulnerable to swift maneuvers. As the royal cortege left, Charles stayed in his study, kept informed by his private secretary, and declined to say goodbye to Camilla, which spoke volumes. Inwardly concentrated on his family's stability, he was determined to protect Charlotte and her younger siblings from suffering any more upheaval. Those in the know about Camilla's timing busied themselves with whooping it up at previously scheduled engagements, lest they appear to be crowing over their sister-in-law. The Queen Consort's personal wing was completely cleared out by the day's end, new linen set, leaving the room as clinically cold and empty as the Red Keep had ever seen. Her presence was thoroughly erased, and her inability to fill the spaces she had once occupied was everywhere. The press release was vague, saying only that the Queen Consort would concentrate on private work at her country home and prepare for engagements outside London. The language was broad that still left people guessing, but both people on the inside and out knew what it was too cool to say. The change was not out of volition but because of a single breakfast event that drew the line and changed balance of power within the royal house permanently. Charlotte's growth out of her accident was quick. The spell had not done permanent damage, mercifully having landed mainly on her dress. But within the royal family it is not the physical consequences, but the emotional fallout from such events that bore most heavily. We couldn't exactly ignore the faint yet lingering feeling of now being on the receiving end of a hostile moment, and the subdued and yet profound one at a time, which would require a bit of attenuation in the days that followed. Life reveled in the ordinary in the aftermath of the plan, in Charlotte's routine nurtured little by little. She kept up her studies, took pleasant walks in the palace gardens, and played with the other members of her household as she always had. Still, there was a new wariness in her bearing, a slight hesitancy at meals, where she'd surreptitiously glance down the head of the table before she lowered herself into her chair. Her parents and Princess, all too aware, tried to find opportunities where they too could sit by her. And certainly played a huge part in Charlotte's journey back to wellness. She was guarding but not fishing, gently steering the focus away. Instead, she involved Charlotte in happy conversation, told stories of her own childhood, and planned some little operations in the stables. Because of Charlotte's passion for horses, these moments of normalcy contributed toward restoring her confidence and the sense of the allies she had in the family. Prince William and Catherine were similarly focused in their approach, determined not to overcorrect. They knew too much focus could risk leaving Charlotte feeling alone or exposed. Rather than discussing what they were going to do, they tried to emphasize normalcy, but also sent the message over and over that this was unacceptable, it's not her fault. Privately, they talked to her about the importance of handling such unkindness with grace, emphasizing the royal family's long-standing requirement to maintain dignity under public pressure. The staged first public appearance since the incident came during a weekend charity event to benefit children's education. This fight was chosen because of the friendly atmosphere and limited media attention. The setting was a community arts center, a space filled with open areas, bold murals and a crowd more focused on the activities that awaited than on royal rumors. The calculated approach was to create a space that allowed for Charlotte to unleash her fab quotient without any judgment whatsoever. The next in line to the throne arrived at the service with her family, and stepped out of the car in a soft green coat and a coordinating beret. It was her smile, real yet contrived, which drew photographers to her face, hiding deep-guarded feelings. Holding hands with her mother as they made their way to the entrance, Charlotte appeared confident as she showed off her independence while inside, playing with children of the same age and painting. In cameras, she beamed her laughter and cheery mood as if applying some bright colors to a canvas, photos that would later appear on the front pages as signs of resilience. Halfway through the event, Princess made a low-key appearance, sitting down with Charlotte at a table where children were making model castles. Their interaction was simple, with Princess stooping to watch what Charlotte was doing, murmuring words of encouragement and remaining beside her for the duration of the visit. Princess's visible support of Charlotte was certainly no accident for those paying close attention. It was a public show of her commitment to protecting and guiding her niece. The media's treatment of the appearance had been primarily positive, with coverage emphasizing how composed Charlotte appeared and how well the palace had positioned Princess Charlotte in her supporting role. Reports depicted the young princess as dignified, the embodiment of grace amid controversy. Photos of her smiling with hands covered in paint and playing with other children seemed to be a different side to the negative picture painted of her that was circulating through the media. Although the palace never directly confirmed its breakfast mishap source, the implication was clear. Charlotte was doing well. And life was moving on, her united family. Surrounded as she was by that, and yet there were still tensions behind closed doors. Her parents were still cautious and knew that peace in the palace was fragile. Even though Charlotte seemed to be back to her old self in public, they were on the lookout for any lasting after effects. Turning a watchful eye to any anxious or apprehensive behavior during an exchange, they made sure that she was always surrounded by trusted people at family get-togethers. Over the following weeks, Charlotte started going back to her usual activities and school commitments. If brought up with her mentioning, the tea episode was discussed and responded to simply and supportively. She refocused her gaze on her future rather than the bemused attention her one undelivered moment bought her. Having been raised under the close watch of one of the world's most watched families, learning how to stay above the public drama while maintaining personal dignity was a valuable lesson for Charlotte in particular. As experts started dissecting the incident, the discussion refocused on more than mere matters of etiquette and delved into palace politics, historical context, and public perceptions of the monarchy. It was no longer about what Camilla intended, now it was about what the incident had revealed about the royal household and how these things might affect the monarchy's long-term reputation. The first speakers were royal historians. Observers have noted that historical squabbles within the royal family were not unprecedented and usually play out behind closed doors. It's always been handled by an understanding of silence and forbearance, a historian told one of the country's national broadcasters. Yet in today's world dominated by social media and mobile cameras, as well as by a hunger for backstage glimpses, total secrecy is not really possible, the historian continued. This specific event, the historian underscored, is interesting not in terms of the act itself, but as proof that no matter how closely guarded a royal world is, it can be revealed. Psychologists who specialize in family dynamics and high-pressured environments provided more perspective. Charlotte may have appeared composed under the circumstances, but public gestures like this can leave lasting subliminal scars on a child's sense of security, a childhood development specialist said, particularly when that action comes from within a family. The expert highlighted the value of Charlotte's public support, framing it as a protective feature that can counteract potential negative consequences. Anne's reaction is fairly typical of a child with a secure attachment, and a child with a secure attachment needs quick intervention, and that trust needs to be maintained by an adult. On another flank, public relations people, with an emphasis on those who do crisis work, zeroed in on perception and the palace response. A well-experienced PR strategist noted that the first palace statement did not put a cork on it, but could have contributed to fans' speculation. Fan speculations that barely or unwittingly supported the same were not even far off from what the travelogues of fans themselves had connoted in that statement, which simply got around laying down details leading to an ambiguous response. When we do not acknowledge what has happened, denial opens up a space that tries to be filled both by the media and by a shocked public. In such scenarios, an advisor explained, a carefully tailored acknowledgement, without laying blame, can do more to stabilize public opinion than silence. Other public relations people dissected the strategic choices made in the aftermath. They praised the decision to bring Charlotte out in public soon after the incident, complimented her for being so collected and having Princess to change the discussion from discord to survival. But they feared Camilla's prolonged disappearance from public view would increase speculation about his ex's true state. They couldn't cover up the leading lady, the queen consort, for long without the public presuming the worst. Analysts stressed that however her return to the public eye is done, it would need to be in a completely positive and non-controversial way. And international observers added an additional dimension to the calculation. For others, the incident was a metaphor for a monarchy at breaking point, that could not preserve the old dignity of the throne in a world where every private moment is reducible to a picture and can be made public. Opinion in some Commonwealth nations speculated on the effect of the event on the relevance of the institution among young people. Some dismissed it as an overblown family skirmish of the kind that often erupts in royal circles. Others argued that it suggested deeper schisms that could damage the monarchy. Time went by, and even in Britain the conversation started to split a bit along generational lines. Older fans of the royal family would brush off the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Younger audiences perceived it more to be a mirror of archaic power balances and interpersonal issues ill-suited to a modern establishment. Social media further polarized these divides, as one camp backed Camilla, another calling for accountability, frequently couched in workplace ethics and child protection. A common thread throughout the talks was the tremendous influence of episodes focused on the youngest royals. Royal children represent the future of the monarchy, and there's nothing that will provoke a stronger public response than when they are perceived to have come to harm or been slighted, far more than spats between adult royals. Whatever the intent of the tea incident was, it was grounded in a real life, due to the fact that it concerned a child who was not only beloved by that child's own right, but was also a member of a prestigious line. But as experts weighed in, it was clear that the fallout from the incident extended far beyond Buckingham Palace. It made an impact on stories about the stability of the monarchy, the palace's key players and its dynamics, and the institution's way of dealing with internal crises in public. Whether the palace realized it or not, the episode had blossomed into a kind of case study about how to manage the difficulty of maintaining tradition and trust in an age where privacy is no longer a given. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more breaking royal updates. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below.